tuberculosis. And he was her lay brother for about 7 years. He became a Redemptorist lay brother when he was about 22. Now, when he was only 5 years old, it was quite clear to his family that God had blessed him in absolutely remarkable ways. Because St. Gerard, he's known as the great wonder worker of the 18th century, because he is basically one long miracle, one after another, his entire life. The very first miracle that we know of comes from when he was 5 years old. One day, little Gerard had gone to the village chapel to say his morning prayers. And when he came back home, he presented his mother with this loaf of white bread. And Mrs. Magella said, "Well, Gerard, where did you get this?" And he said, "There was a beautiful lady in the church who gave it to me." So Mrs. Magella, she cut up the loaf of bread and gave it to her family. She realized it was the best bread she'd ever tasted. Now, the same thing happened for several days in a row. Each morning, young Gerard would go to the church, and he'd say his morning prayers. He'd come back home with this loaf of white bread for his family. Mrs. Magella was eventually getting a little bit concerned about who this beautiful lady in the church was. So one day, she sent Gerard's older sister to follow him. So you can imagine there's little 5-year-old Gerard. He's running out of the family house down the village street, and his sister behind him at a discreet distance so that he's not aware that she's following him. He goes into the church, she follows him. He goes up to the statue of the Madonna. So you know, a Madonna statue, that's the statue of the Blessed Virgin, where she's carrying the infant Jesus in one arm. And Gerard goes up to the statue of the Madonna, and he begins to say his morning prayers. Meanwhile, his sister is in the back of the church behind this big pillar, and she's looking in front of the pillar to see what's happening. After Gerard's praying for just a couple minutes, suddenly the statue comes to life. And Our Lady steps off of her pedestal, and the child Jesus gets out of her arm. Now, in that statue, the child Jesus, like the statue of the infant of Prague, so he's holding the orb of the world. It looks like a ball, but it actually represents that Jesus is king of the universe. So Jesus gets out of his mother's arm and then goes right to the middle of the church and begins playing ball with Gerard with the orb of the world. It completely blows out all our ideas of sanctity like that. So if you could imagine Gerard's sister behind the pillar in the back of the church, must have been like this. So after a few minutes of playing ball together in the church, Jesus takes the orb of the world back into his hand, gets back up into his mother's arms, and Our Lady presents this loaf of white bread to Gerard for his family. Now, we cannot expect miracles like that to happen to us, but it gives us an important lesson with regards to prayer, that Jesus and Mary are always thinking of you with love. And they appreciate when you think of them with love too, especially to start and end the day with them. Even if it's with something short, morning and evening prayers. Tomorrow at Mass, we'll be talking about the devotion of the 3 Hail Marys. And even if you do nothing else, those 3 Hail Marys each morning and each evening, it will make God very happy. Now we can fast forward 10 years in the life of St. Gerard Magella to the time when he was 15. And back in those days, even the teenagers had to go out to get a job to help support the family, and Gerard was no different. So he managed to get a job with the local bishop of Macedonia in southern Italy, and the bishop was a rather cantankerous old man who would just explode with anger at the slightest provocation. Now, Gerard managed to get a job as the bishop's porter. That meant that he had these big keys. Back in those days, they had these huge keys for the cathedrals, etc. And he'd have them on this big keychain. So each morning, Gerard would go over to the cathedral, and he would take one of the keys and unlock the cathedral door. Then he'd go over to the bishop's residence and unlock that door also. Now, one of the main jobs of the porter, back in those days, was to draw water from the well. We don't have to worry about drawing water from wells anymore, since we've got spigots and taps in our houses. But back in those days, yeah, everyone had to have a well, and certainly the cathedral did also. So each morning, teenage Gerard would go out to the well, and of course, wherever you've got a well, you've got a bucket to draw water with. And of course, the bucket is attached to a rope. So one day, as Gerard's lowering down the bucket to draw the water, suddenly the bishop's keys, which were still in his hand, accidentally slip out, and the keys fall to the bottom of the well. Poor Gerard, he knows the bishop is going to be so mad. So what does he do? He goes back to his room and he takes out the statue of the Bambino. Now, you all have a Bambino at home in your Christmas creche set. That's the statue of the infant Jesus lying in the manger of Bethlehem. Usually he's got his arms out like this, welcoming the shepherds. So Gerard takes out the statue of the Bambino and he brings it down to the well. He takes the rope from the bucket and then, don't try this now. He wraps the rope around the statue of the infant Jesus and then very carefully lowers the statue into the well. He says a few prayers and then he brings the rope back up again. Here comes the statue of the Bambino Jesus, the bishop's keys in his hand. Again, we can't expect miracles like that to happen to us. But again, it teaches us an important lesson, this time in confidence in God. God is good. He's a loving Father to us, and that's why we can have confidence in Him. Even when God doesn't answer our prayers the way we would like Him to, God's always giving us what we need. Oftentimes it's going to be patience and perseverance and carrying our daily cross. And that, honestly, is the best gift of all. Everyone's got crosses in their life. Even like smaller children, sometimes it's going to be a question of having a difficulty with a certain subject in school, or maybe there's this brat at school who's being a bully, or maybe we're the ones who are being the bully, etc. As we get older, we have bigger problems in life. We can have financial problems, we can have family problems, we can have work problems, we can have emotional problems. That's why we have to have confidence that God does want to help us. Even if we cannot see how He's acting in our life, we know that He is, and we want simply to abandon ourselves to His goodness, to His love, to His mercy. Now I'd like to go on to tell a couple stories for the mothers here particularly, because St. Gerard Magella, as you probably realize, is the patron saint of mothers and expectant mothers. And at first glance, this may seem rather odd. Why is it that an 18th century Redemptorist lay brother, who lived only to age 29, would be the patron saint for moms and expectant moms? I mean, it seems almost counterintuitive. The obvious choice for the patron saint of mothers and expectant mothers would be Our Lady, or at least St. Anne. So why is St. Gerard your patron saint? A couple stories to explain this. One time when Brother Gerard, by this time he was in his 20s and he was a Redemptorist lay brother, he was visiting an old school child of his. They had gone to school together years before. And the friend had been married for several years, but the friend and his wife had been unable to have any children yet. And the friend was complaining to Brother Gerard, saying, "Brother, my wife and I were doing everything right by God, and we're praying to God to give us a child, and why isn't God hearing our prayers?" And St. Gerard says, "But you don't know. Your wife is pregnant, and in 9 months, you're going to have a baby boy." 9 months later, sure enough, the baby boy was born. Now, another story to explain why he's your patron saint. On another occasion, Brother Gerard was visiting a family in the vicinity of the monastery, and as he left the house, he accidentally dropped his handkerchief. Now, the mother of the family noticed this, and so she picked up St. Gerard's handkerchief, gave it to her 7-year-old daughter, and said, "Look, dear, Brother Gerard's not too far away, just run out into the street and give him back his handkerchief." So the little girl, she runs out into the street and runs up to the saint saying, Brother Gerard, you dropped your handkerchief." So St. Gerard, he stops and he turns back to her and he gives her this funny look, and then he presses the handkerchief back into her hand. And he says, "No," he says, "you keep them, because one day it's going to be important for you." So that little girl, she grew up to be a young lady. She got married. She was expecting her first child. But the labor was going very difficultly. 2 doctors were both called in, and they both said there's no hope, that both the mother and the child will certainly die. And so this happens, of course, years after St. Gerard had already died. And so his cause for beatification had already been opened. And so the husband of the lady who had been the little girl, he remembered about the handkerchief. And so he ran to his wife's room, opened up the chest of drawers, took out the handkerchief, brought it back to his wife, pushed the handkerchief into her hand. She held the handkerchief of St. Gerard throughout her labor, and lo and behold, she gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby, and she herself perfectly survived. And the 2 doctors afterwards said, There's no way to explain this. And like they said, obviously, this is a miracle of God to prove the power of the intercession of Brother Gerard Magella. So that's really the first miracle of St. Gerard Magella on behalf of mothers and expectant mothers. And it explains why he is your patron saint. It also explains why handkerchiefs are blessed in honor of St. Gerard Magella for mothers. Now, during our parish missions, the Redemptorists, we always try to give these devotions to in honor of St. Gerard Magella. And of course, we aim towards the younger mothers, obviously. But one time, I think it was back in 1999, our fathers were preaching at the Society Chapel in Perth, Australia. And after the devotions, there was an older lady who came up to them and said, "Hey, fathers," she said, "hey, St. Gerard Magella, he's the patron saint of us older moms as well." And she had a beautiful story to tell. She said that many years earlier, when her son turned 18, he immediately left the house without ever saying goodbye to his parents. You can imagine, the poor parents were beside themselves because they didn't know where their child was. They didn't even know that he was still alive or not. Now, the mother fortunately had a great devotion to St. Gerard, and so in the living room on the little wall bracket, she had this statue of St. Gerard, and every night she would take this little votive candle, light it, and put the candle in front of the statue, and she would pray one Hail Mary to the saint, asking the saint to keep her boy safe. Years went past. 5, 10, 15, 20. One day, there was a knock at the door. She opened it, and it was her son, almost 40 years old now. And he had come back finally to apologize to his parents. He had gone all around the world, and he had finally come back to apologize that he had never said goodbye to them. So you see how good St. Gerard Magella is. He's the patron saint of mothers, expectant mothers. He's also patron saint of families. He's one of the patron saints of the pro-life movement as well. And he's also the patron saint of a good confession, because he used to accompany the Redemptorist fathers on their parish missions, and he would simply kneel in the sanctuary of the church while the priests were hearing confessions, and St. Gerard would be saying rosary after rosary for everyone who was in line for confession, asking God that they would have the grace to make a good confession of their lives. So St. Gerard is a wonderful patron. We all have, every family has a black sheep in the family. So remember to pray to St. Gerard, because St. Gerard, even if it takes years for someone to convert, that's okay, because it's always worth the wait. And St. Gerard will help bring that child, that black sheep, back to God, back to the sacraments, back to the church. We simply have to wait for God's time. In the basilica, in the town where he died, in the town of Capocella in southern Italy, there's a huge basilica. There used to be a very beautiful basilica, but it was destroyed in the Italian earthquake back in, 1981, I think. And they rebuilt this modern monstrosity. Nevertheless, even as in the church that it is now, it's this huge basilica, and the basilica is filled with literally tens of thousands of ex-votos. So ex-votos, that's thank yous from people. The Italians usually make them in the form of a different kind of silver plaques, usually with thank you for such and such grace, that get hung on the wall. And other people from around the world, from other nations, will send in thank yous also to St. Gerard that are also put up on the walls of the basilica. Oftentimes there are family photos from families who have received a special grace from the saint for the health of a child, or the grace to be able to adopt a child, etc. There's also all these letters from people across the world, asking St. Gerard for a special grace for their family or for a certain child. So St. Gerard, he's a wonderful patron saint for families and for children, for mothers. So if you've got any black sheep in the family, if you're having difficulties in your family life, don't forget to pray to this great saint. He wants to help because he has such great love for families, children, and moms. Now, as I say, I do have the relic of the bone of St. Gerard Magella. I'd like to invite you all to come up. It might be easier, instead of being just two, if you could just line up and just across the front, actually. I'll just go from person to person. I'll give you all a blessing with the relic of the bone of St. Gerard, and I'll touch the top of your head with the relic. You're all invited to come up.